All right, so this is Plennie. He sashayed his way backwards into the Guinness Book of World Records and then sashayed his way into obscurity. And I think it's time to bring Plennie back. What do you say? Yes? Are you with me? Yes? Okay. But in order to go forward with his story, first we have to go backwards into history because Plennie would have wanted it that way. Plennie was born in 1895 in Abilene, Texas, to parents who never told anybody where the hell the name Plennie came from. Nobody knows. However, his mother's name was Willie Drusilla Warren Wingo Wingo. So apparently they just do things a little different in Texas. But Plennie was very precocious. By 8 years old, he had his own business. Doing what, you may ask? I'm so glad you asked. He was catching and selling live rattlesnakes. 8 years old. And he told his mom at that same age that when he grew up, he was going to see the world. By 1920, he was married, had a child. By 1924, he opened a restaurant. It was called the Crescent Cafe, and it was in the most bustling part of Abilene's financial district. Things were going great. And then in 1928, Plennie got busted for selling booze. Womp womp. But it was just a speed bump. He got right back on track. The restaurant was doing great. They were getting ready to expand. And then what happened in 1929? The stock market crashed and Plennie and everybody else lost his shirt. And he had to close the restaurant because you cannot keep a restaurant open when there are no paying customers. And it was terrible. And it was a worldwide financial crisis. And the poorer were just getting poorer. But in the meantime, the rich were coming up with new ways to entertain themselves, like bridge as a spectator sport, crossword puzzles. Board games like Monopoly were incredibly popular. And despite prohibition, the wealthy had their hooch, and it was a great time of cocktail innovation. So while the rich were getting drunk and playing cards, the working class were looking for ways to mitigate the misery, but also make a buck. So they invented things like dance till you drop marathons and pole sitters like Alvin Shipwreck Kelly and human flies like Jack Clemens were earning money through endorsements and advertising and sponsorships. And one night, while sitting and reading the newspaper, Plennie could hear his 15-year-old daughter and her friends in the next room talking about the most recent crazy stunt that somebody had pulled. It may well have been fellow Texan Bill Williams. Yes, William Williams, Texas, whatever. Mr. Williams was paid by a peanut company to push a peanut up Pikes Peak in Colorado with his nose. And he wasn't the last person to do it. But that's another story. But it was at this moment that Plennie realized that what he really needed was a gimmick. He needed to come up with something that nobody had ever done before. And he had an epiphany. He would walk around the world backwards. His wife thought he was crazy. His daughter encouraged him and said, well, if nobody's done it before, may as well be you, Pops. And so he did. He started training in the wee hours in the dark to avoid any unwanted scrutiny. And he started by holding a mirror so he could see where he was going. But then he spotted an ad in a magazine for these very nifty sunglasses with rear view mirrors on the sides. That was perfect. Perfect. So now he began with a practice promenade from Santa Monica to Fort Worth. And in Fort Worth on April 15th, 1931, he set out for his reverse pedestrian world tour. He pedaled through the Plain States during the Dust Bowl And then he moonwalked into Missouri. Once he was through Missouri, he shuffled through Chicago. And then, just as he got to the outskirts of Canton, Ohio, calamity struck. He fell in a hole and broke his ankle and spent 3 weeks in a hospital recovering. However, that was really the only injury he sustained in his entire trip, which is kind of amazing. Once back on his feet, he got to Pittsburgh, where a cop with a sense of humor pulled him over and wrote him a ticket for mopery in the 2nd degree. And when Plennie looked at the ticket, it said, "Have a good trip." So they had a good laugh, and then Plennie was off to New York. All of this, of course, walking backwards. When he got to New York, he got his mail, including a letter from his wife, Abdallah, who said she'd had enough of this shit. She needed him to come home. His daughter needed him. And if he didn't come home, she was filing for divorce. Well, feeling dejected and rejected, Plennie went on to Boston. And there he met a man who was the head of a shoe company who promised him safe passage across the pond. And so why are we not advancing? There we go. He boarded a ship. It was the merchant ship Seattle Spirit. And he walked up the plank backwards on January 12th, 1932. But unbeknownst to Plennie, his friend, Mr. Shoe Guy, had shanghaied him. He was stuck working on this ship. The steward confiscated his passport. He couldn't get off the ship for weeks. He finally managed to escape while they were docked in Hamburg. And from there, he moved on across Europe. He ambled his way backwards into Nazi-occupied Germany. And he continued across Europe while meeting so many wonderful people that helped him along the way. He was given food and clothing and shoes and shelter. And when he got to the border of Turkey, he was again apprehended, spent a few hours in jail, was released, got back on the road, headed to Istanbul. And when he got to Istanbul, he was surrounded by Turkish police, arrested, and thrown in jail. And he was in jail for several days until he got out, promised he was done with this backward walking nonsense, and headed back to Marseille, where he boarded yet another ship to come back to the United States. Despite all of his efforts and his self-promotion, Plennie returned home to Texas in 1932 with $4 in his pocket. No wife and very few prospects. He and Abdallah did reconcile and remarried, but it didn't last and they divorced again a few years later. Then at age 50, Plennie was working in a restaurant when he met and fell in love with an 18-year-old waitress by the name of Juanita. And in 1945, they were married. And in 1948, they started walking together. How cute are they? He did experience some fame. He published a book, which very few people bought. And the Guinness Book of World Records has an entry that reads, "The greatest ever exponent of reverse pedestrianism has been Plennie L. Wingo, USA, who completed his 12,875 kilometer or 8,000 mile transcontinental walk from Santa Monica, California, USA to Istanbul, Turkey, from 15 April 1931 to 24 October 1932. It's also worth noting that Plennie holds the reverse pedestrian land speed record for 45 miles in 12 and a half hours. And he did all of this almost always wearing a three-piece suit and dress shoes. Yeah, and he went through 12 pairs of dress shoes. Whoops. Sorry about that. Oh, we're walking again. We're walking. It's a reverse slideshow. And then in 1976, with the bicentennial, he had a bit of a comeback. And he was on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson and in the show Real People. If any of you remember that TV show, I will post a link to it in the Something Weird Facebook group. He was also a darling of Ripley's Believe It or Not. And that same year, he reverse walked 400 miles from San Francisco to Santa Monica, finishing his unique career as a retropedaling world pedestrian right where it all started in 1931 in front of the Ripley's Museum. He had come full circle, even though he didn't actually circumnavigate the globe like he wanted to. And why exactly was he detained in Turkey? It's really uncertain, but I guess that's nobody's business but the Turks. Plennie lived to the ripe old age of 98, but fortune had eluded Plennie, and sadly he died in poverty in 1993 with his darling wife Juanita by his side. In an interview, Plennie once said, "I walked backward about 7,000 miles, it was actually 8,000, saw most of America and Europe, added, I believe, 10 years to my life, managed to eat every day, met thousands of interesting people, saw many wonderful sights, and have nothing to regret." I think there is an apt word for people like Plennie in Yiddish. He is a mensch. And the more I learn about Plennie, the more relatable he becomes. How many of us are walking around with these amazing ideas that other people don't understand or don't support, and yet are still able to go through with it and come out the other side unscathed without bitterness? Art, seriously. In some ways, he is a little bit like a modern-day Sisyphus. If Sisyphus chose to roll that boulder uphill backwards with his butt. And because, sorry, what was that?
You must imagine Sisyphus happy.
So I would like to close by raising a glass to Plennie and that little spark of Plennie that lives in all of us, because, believe it or not, history is full of men, usually, who are all a little touched with a delightful bit of madness and a penchant for making bets. Here's just a small sampling of some of the fellas who have walked backwards on great adventures. So to Plennie and all those who choose to see the world from a little different vantage point. Thanks.